Inside Houston, Tango Blast. Texas's most dangerous prison ganged to quiet before the count. The fluorescent lights hum in D Block at 4:47 a.m. No one's awake yet, but no one's really sleeping either. In a Texas maximum security facility, sleep is something you negotiate with, a fragile truce between exhaustion and vigilance. The air is thick, recycled through steel vents that rattle every few seconds like a mechanical cough. It smells like industrial soap, sweat, and something else. Something sour and human that no amount of bleach can erase. A corrections officer walks the tier, boots echoing against concrete. He doesn't look into the cells. He's learned not to. Eye contact at this hour is a question, and questions invite answers. His radio crackles. Static, then silence. He keeps moving. Inside cell 247, a man named Reynaldo Garza lies on his bunk, eyes open, staring at the underside of the mattress above him. He's been awake for 3 hours. Not because he wants to be, because he has to be. In here, the first rule isn't about respect or territory or loyalty. It's simpler than that. Stay aware, because the moment you let your guard down, the moment you forget where you are, this place reminds you. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. It's how this community stays connected. If this kind of true story resonates with you, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who won't look at prisons the same way again. Reynaldo was a Houston native, grew up in the Second Ward, with the freeways cut through neighborhoods like scars. He ran with a crew that called themselves Tango Blast, not a gang. They'd say a movement, a family, a way to survive when the system had already written you off. But the courts didn't see it that way. Neither did the prosecution. And now, at 26 years old, he's 4 years into a 15-year sentence for aggravated robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. He didn't pull the trigger, but he was in the car. That's all it took. The prison he's in now, let's call it Eastfield Unit, is one of dozens scattered across the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. It's not the biggest, not the most infamous, but it has a reputation. Guards who worked other units say there's something different about Eastfield, something harder to control. The gangs here don't just exist, they govern. They set prices. They settle disputes. They decide who eats, who gets protection, and who gets left to fend for themselves. And at the center of it all, quietly, methodically, is Tango Blast. Most people outside Texas have never heard the name. It doesn't carry the weight of the Aryan Brotherhood or the Mexican Mafia. It doesn't have the media presence of MS-13. But inside these walls, Tango Blast isn't just a gang. It's an infrastructure, a shadow government, and understanding how it works, how it grew from the streets of Houston into one of the most powerful prison organizations in the state, requires going back further than most people expect. It requires understanding what happens when the system stops protecting people and starts warehousing them. The birth of Tango Blast, Houston, 1998. To understand Tango Blast, you have to understand Houston in the late 1990s. The city was exploding. Oil money, immigration sprawl. Entire neighborhoods transformed in the span of a decade. But beneath the gloss of new construction and economic growth, the streets were fracturing. Hispanic gangs had always existed in pockets. Local crews tied to specific blocks, specific housing projects. But they were fragmented, disorganized, vulnerable. And inside the Texas prison system, that fragmentation was deadly. In 1998, a group of Houston inmates found themselves caught between two forces. On one side, the Mexican Mafia, also known as La Im, a highly structured prison gang that demanded allegiance, taxes, and absolute obedience. On the other, the Texas Syndicate, another powerful organization with roots in California, equally ruthless, equally hierarchical. Both groups saw Houston inmates as recruitment opportunities, fresh bodies, foot soldiers. But many of these men didn't want to pledge loyalty to an organization that had nothing to do with their neighborhoods, their families, or their city. They didn't want to take orders from shot callers in other units who'd never set foot in their wards. So they made a choice. They formed their own group. It started small. A handful of guys from a different part of Houston, Second Ward, North Side, South Side, Southwest, who agreed on one principle: Houston first. No outside leadership. No rigid hierarchy. No blood in, blood out initiation. You didn't have to kill to join. You didn't have to smuggle drugs or extort other inmates. You just had to be from Houston, and you had to hold it down. They called themselves Tango Blast. The name came from a Houston Astros, host-owned Tango Blast, a reference to the baseball team and the phonetic alphabet used by law enforcement. It was a nod to identity, to pride, to something bigger than a street corner. Within months, the idea spread, not just in Eastfield but across the state. Inmates from Dallas formed D-Town Tango. San Antonio became Alamo City Tango. Austin, Fort Worth, West Texas. Each city spawned its own chapter, loosely connected but fiercely independent. By the early 2000s, Tango Blast had become the largest gang in the Texas prison system, not because it was the most violent, but because it filled a void. It gave men who had nothing a sense of place. But that identity came with a cost. Because inside a maximum security prison, identity is currency, and currency attracts predators. Power without structure. What made Tango Blast different from other prison gangs wasn't just its origin, it was its philosophy or lack thereof. Most prison gangs operate like militaries. There's a general, lieutenants, soldiers. Orders flow downward. Disobedience is punished. Loyalty is enforced through violence and fear. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Texas Syndicate, they all function this way. Centralized power, clear consequences. Tango Blast rejected that model entirely. There was no supreme leader, no council of shot callers issuing commands from administrative segregation. Each chapter operated independently. If you were host-owned Tango, you answered other host-owned members in your unit. If you were D-Town, you ran with D-Town. The groups respected each other, sometimes collaborated, but they didn't take orders from one another. On paper, this sounds democratic, even progressive. In practice, it created chaos, because without a central authority, there was no way to regulate behavior, no way to enforce rules. If a Tango member in one unit stabbed a rival gang member, it didn't require approval from higher-ups. There were no higher-ups. The decision was local, personal, and the consequences, lockdowns, investigations, retaliation, fell on everyone. Prison officials initially saw this as a weakness. They assumed Tango Blast would collapse under its own disorganization, but they were wrong. What Tango lacked in structure, it made up for in numbers. By 2005, Tango Blast had an estimated 17,000 members across Texas prisons. That was more than the Mexican Mafia and Texas Syndicate combined. And because the group had no formal initiation, no blood oath, no documented leadership, it was almost impossible to prosecute under gang enhancement laws. You couldn't prove someone was Tango unless they admitted it. And most didn't. They wore the symbols, tattoos of city skylines, stars, the word Tango in Gothic script, but they claimed it was pride, not affiliation. Hometown love, nothing criminal. The courts struggled to respond. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice created a gang intelligence unit, tracked symbols, monitored communication. But Tango Blast adapted. Members stopped getting visible tattoos. They used coded language. They operated in the gray space between organized crime and organic association. And inside the units, they kept growing. Because in a place where survival depends on alliances, Tango offered something rare: flexibility. You didn't have to follow orders. You didn't have to participate in hits. You could keep your head down, serve your time, and still claim protection under the name. But that protection wasn't free. It required participation, presence, a willingness to stand up when the moment came. And in a maximum security prison, that moment always comes. Reynaldo's first week. Reynaldo Garza arrived at Eastfield on a Tuesday in September. He was transported in a white van with blacked-out windows, shackled at the wrists and ankles, sitting next to 3 other men he didn't know. None of them spoke. The drive took 4 hours, most of it through flat, featureless land dotted with oil rigs and faded billboards. When the van pulled through the gates, Reynaldo felt the air change. The facility loomed ahead, low, gray building surrounded by double-fenced razor wire. Guard towers at each corner. Surveillance cameras angled downward like mechanical vultures. He was processed in silence. Stripped, searched, issued a white uniform, 2 sheets, a thin mattress. A corrections officer handed him a laminated card with the unit rules. Don't fight. Don't gamble. Don't possess contraband. Report to your assigned job. Obey orders. Simple enough. But the officer didn't mention the other rules, the ones that weren't written down. Reynaldo learned those in the first 48 hours. He was placed in D Block, a general population unit that housed about 200 men. The cells were designed for 1 person, but almost all of them held 2. Reynaldo's cellmate was a man named Hector, mid-30s, covered in tattoos, quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Hector didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice, just nodded when Reynaldo walked in and went back to reading a worn paperback. That first night, Reynaldo lay awake on the top bunk, listening. The unit never went silent. Even after lights out, there were sounds, footsteps, whispers, the clang of a metal tray being passed between cells. Someone coughing, someone praying in Spanish. And beneath it all, a low hum of tension, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The next morning, Reynaldo was assigned to the kitchen. It was considered a decent job, better than laundry, better than the fields. The work was hot, repetitive, and exhausting, but it came with small privileges: extra food, access to supplies, a chance to move through the unit during restricted hours. It also came with exposure. The kitchen was run by inmates, supervised loosely by a handful of guards who mostly stayed in the office. The real authority belonged to a man named Chewy, a lifer who controlled the schedule, the inventory, and the flow of contraband that moved through the facility. Chewy was Tango. Reynaldo didn't know that at first, but within a few days it became obvious. The way other inmates deferred to him, the way guards avoided confrontation, the small nods of acknowledgement when certain people walked past. Chewy ran the kitchen the way a CEO runs a company. Calm, efficient, and utterly in control. On Reynaldo's 3rd day, Chewy pulled him aside during cleanup. "You from Houston?" Reynaldo nodded. "What ward?" "2nd." Chewy studied him for a moment, then handed him a mop. "Aight, you eat with us." That was it. No initiation, no test, just recognition. Because in here, where you're from matters more than who you are. The economy of survival. Within 2 weeks, Reynaldo understood how Eastfield really worked. The official rules, the ones printed on laminated cards and posted in the day room, were theater. They existed to satisfy oversight committees, to justify budgets, to create the illusion of order. But the real rules, the ones that determined whether you ate well or poorly, whether you stayed safe or became a target, whether you served your time in relative peace or constant fear, those rules were written by inmates. And at the center of that system was commerce. Prisons are supposed to be spaces of deprivation. No money, no luxuries, no autonomy. But human beings are economic creatures. Where there's scarcity, markets emerge. And in a place where men are locked in cages for years at a time, those markets become sophisticated, ruthless, and essential. Reynaldo learned the currency hierarchy quickly. At the bottom, commissary items. Ramen noodles, chips, candy bars, instant coffee. These were the coins of small transactions. You could trade a bag of chips for a haircut, a pack of cookies for laundry service, 3 soups for someone to write a letter if you couldn't spell well. In the middle, tobacco. Even though smoking was officially banned in Texas prisons, tobacco circulated constantly. Guards smuggled it in. Visitors passed it during contact visits. Inmates rolled it into thin cigarettes using Bible pages, newspaper, anything that would burn. A pouch of rolling tobacco could buy you a week's worth of protection, a sharpened weapon, or information. At the top, cell phones and drugs. Cell phones were the most valuable contraband in the unit. A single smartphone, smuggled in through a corrupt guard or launched over the fence in a football, could sell for $2,000 in commissary credit. With a phone, you could run operations on the outside, coordinate drug deals, manage money, communicate with family, maintain relationships. You could be more than a number in a cell. You could still be a person. Drugs were simpler, but more dangerous. Methamphetamine, synthetic cannabinoids, prescription pills stolen from the infirmary. These didn't just provide escape. They provided control. If you controlled the supply, you controlled addicts. And addicts would do anything. Steal, fight, inform, betray. Chewy didn't deal drugs directly. That would have been too visible, too risky. But he facilitated. He knew which guards looked the other way. He knew which inmates were trustworthy and which were desperate. He managed the flow without touching the product, taking a cut in favors, in loyalty and influence. This was how Tango operated in Eastfield, not through violence, though violence was always an option, but through infrastructure. Reynaldo watched and learned. He saw how disputes were handled. If two inmates had a problem, they didn't go to the guards. That was snitching, and snitching was a death sentence. Instead, they brought it to someone respected, someone neutral. In D Block, that was often Chewy. He'd listen to both sides, weigh the situation, and make a call. Sometimes it was simple. One guy owed the other commissary. He had a week to pay it back. Other times it was more complex. Territorial disputes, disrespect, old beefs from the streets that had followed them inside. Most of the time, problems got resolved without bloodshed. But not always. One afternoon, during rec time in the yard, Reynaldo saw a man named Flacco get jumped near the weight pile. 3 guys surrounded him, no weapons, just fists and boots. It was over in 30 seconds. Guards blew whistles, called for backup, but by the time they arrived, the attackers had melted back into crowd. Flacco was taken to medical. Broken nose, cracked ribs, swollen jaw. Reynaldo asked Hector what happened. He owed. Hector said, not looking up from his book, didn't pay. Who'd he owe? Everybody. The message was clear. The system had rules, and the rules were enforced. But what struck Reynaldo wasn't the violence. It was the efficiency. 3 men, 30 seconds. No chaos, no shouting, just consequence. That night, lying in his bunk, Reynaldo thought about his sister. She was 17, still in high school, living with their grandmother in Houston. He'd promised her he'd stay out of trouble, serve his time, come home different. But already, he could feel the place changing him. Not because he wanted it to, because survival required it. You couldn't stay neutral in here. Neutrality was a target. You had to pick a side, align yourself, contribute. And for someone from Houston, from the 2nd Ward, there was only one choice. Tango wasn't just protection. It was identity in a place designed to erase you. The invisible hand. Corrections Officer Marcus Webb had been working at Eastfield for 6 years. He wasn't a lifer, didn't plan to be, but the job paid better than anything else he qualified for after getting out of the Army. $32 an hour, benefits, overtime whenever he wanted it. In rural Texas, that was enough to buy a house, support a family, build something stable. But the work was corrosive. Webb wasn't naive. He knew prisons were brutal, violent places. He'd accepted that going in. What he hadn't anticipated was the moral erosion, the way the lines between right and wrong started to blur after a few years, the way small compromises accumulated into something he didn't recognize. It started innocently enough. An inmate offered him $20 to pass a letter to someone in another unit, against policy, but harmless. The letter wasn't contraband. It wasn't gang-related. Just a guy trying to stay in touch with a friend. Webb pocketed the cash and moved on. Then it was cigarettes. $50 to bring in a pouch of tobacco. Again, not exactly dangerous. Smoking was banned, but half the staff smoked outside the gates anyway. What was the difference? Then it was a cell phone. $500, cash, left in an envelope in Webb's mailbox at home. No name, no note, just the money and a burner phone wrapped in plastic. Webb knew who it was from, knew what it meant, knew he should report it, refuse, walk away. But $500 was 2 weeks of groceries, a car payment, a night out with his wife without checking the bank account first. He brought the phone in. That was 2 years ago. Since then, Webb had brought in dozens more, sometimes phones. Sometimes pills stolen from his brother-in-law, who worked at a pharmacy. Sometimes messages, packages, small favors that seemed insignificant on their own, but added up to something much larger. Webb told himself he wasn't corrupt. Not really. He wasn't letting murderers out. Wasn't covering up assaults. He was just facilitating, making life a little more bearable for guys who were already serving their time. What was the harm in that? But deep down, he knew the truth. He'd been bought. Not all at once. Not with a single transaction. But piece by piece, compromise by compromise, until he crossed so many lines he couldn't see the original boundary anymore. And the people who owned him, Chewy and the Tango Network, were patient, strategic, and careful. They never asked for too much at once. Never put him in a position where he might panic and confess. They treated him well, paid him fairly, and made sure he understood that as long as he cooperated, he was safe. But the moment he became a liability, Webb didn't want to think about that. The truth was, Webb was an outlier. Corruption in Texas prisons was endemic. A 2018 report by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice found that more than 200 employees had been arrested or fired for smuggling contraband in a single year. Phones, drugs, weapons, all of it flowing through guards, kitchen staff, maintenance workers, even medical personnel. The pay was too low. The risks were manageable. And the demand was infinite. Inmates would pay anything for a connection to the outside world. And there would always be someone willing to supply it. Webb walked D-Block during third shift, his boots echoing in the quiet. Most of the cells were dark. A few men sat awake, reading under dim security lights. One inmate nodded at him as he passed. Webb nodded back. Professionalism. Routine. But both of them knew the truth. When the system breaks. In March of that year, something changed at Eastfield. It started with a staffing shortage. Budget cuts at the state level had reduced funding for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and prisons across the state were operating below capacity. Eastfield was supposed to have 45 corrections officers per shift. Instead, it had 28. Guard towers went unmanned. Searches were skipped. Patrols were reduced to the bare minimum. The inmates noticed immediately. For years, the balance of power in Eastfield had been precarious. Guards maintained control not through overwhelming force, but through presence, through the constant, visible threat of consequence. When that presence diminished, the vacuum filled instantly. Fights increased. Contraband flooded in. Disputes that would have been resolved quietly escalated into open violence. And in the middle of it all, the gangs adapted. Tango Blast, with its decentralized structure, was particularly well suited to chaos. There was no single leader to target, no command structure to disrupt. The organization functioned like a network, resilient, distributed, almost impossible to dismantle. But that same lack of structure created problems. Because without clear leadership, every local tango group operated according to its own logic. What made sense in one unit might create disaster in another. And when tensions rose, when violence became inevitable, there was no one to step in and de-escalate. Reynaldo saw it firsthand. A guy named Beto, a tango member from the north side, got into an argument with a member of the Texas syndicate over a gambling debt. $50 in commissary. Normally, this would have been handled quietly. Beto would have paid, or worked it off, or taken a beating and moved on. But Beto refused. Said he didn't know anything. Said the game was rigged. The Texas syndicate gave him 3 days to pay. Beto laughed it off. On the 4th day, Beto was found in his cell with a sharpened piece of metal buried in his side. Not deep enough to kill him. That would have triggered a full lockdown and investigation. But deep enough to send a message. Pay your debts. The attack should have ended there. Beto survived. He was moved to medical, then to another unit. Problem solved. But Tango didn't see it that way. Word spread through D-Block that the Texas syndicate had crossed a line, that they'd attacked a Tango member over a bullshit debt. That disrespect couldn't stand. Reynaldo wasn't involved in the decision. He wasn't even asked. But within a week, 2 Texas syndicate members in D-Block were jumped during rec time. One ended up in the infirmary. The other refused medical treatment, which meant he was more afraid of being labeled a snitch than of his injuries. The guards responded with a unit-wide lockdown. 23 hours a day in your cell. 1 hour for showers and phone calls. Staggered by pod. No rec time. No day room. No movement. The lockdown lasted 19 days. For Reynaldo, those 19 days felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. The cell, already small, became suffocating. Hector barely spoke. They ate in silence, read in silence, stared at the walls in silence. The only sounds were the shuffle of guards outside, the occasional shout from another cell, the mechanical grind of the ventilation system. Reynaldo's mind started to turn inward. He thought about the choices that had brought him here. The robbery, the car, the moment he could have said no but didn't. He thought about his sister, his grandmother, the neighborhood he'd never see the same way again. And he thought about Beto. $50. That's what it had cost. $50 and a refusal to back down. And now half the unit was locked in cages because pride mattered more than peace. But Reynaldo also understood something else. In here, pride wasn't optional. It was survival. The moment you let someone take something from you, money, respect, dignity, you became prey. And once you were prey, you stayed prey until you fought back or died. The system didn't create that dynamic, but it made it inevitable. Because when you strip men of everything, freedom, autonomy, privacy, hope, the only thing left is identity. And identity is worth dying for. The cost of belonging. The lockdown ended on a Thursday morning. No announcement. No explanation. The doors just opened and movement resumed. Inmates filed into the day room cautiously, like animals testing the air after a storm. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had just been compressed, pressurized, waiting for release. Reynaldo returned to the kitchen. Chewy was already there, organizing the morning meal prep with the same calm efficiency as always. He nodded at Reynaldo, but didn't say anything about the lockdown, about Beto, about the retaliation. It was understood. Business as usual. But Reynaldo felt different. Something had shifted during those 19 days in the cell. Not a single moment of clarity, but a gradual accumulation of understanding. He'd come to Eastfield thinking he could do his time quietly, keep his head down, stay out of trouble, that if he just followed the rules, both official and unofficial, he'd be okay. But there were no safe spaces here, no neutral corners. The moment he accepted that meal with Chewy, the moment he identified his host on, he'd entered a system that demanded participation. Not always, not constantly, but when it mattered, when the group was tested, silence was an option. And the thing that haunted him most wasn't the violence. It was how normal it had become. He watched a man get stabbed over $50 and felt nothing, not horror, not outrage, just recognition. This is how things work. This is the price. That numbness terrified him more than anything else in this place. One afternoon, during a rare moment of privacy in the kitchen storage room, Reynaldo found himself talking to an older inmate named Ruben. Ruben was in his 50s, serving life without parole for a murder he committed in his 20s. He'd been Tango since the beginning, back when it was just a handful of guys trying not to get swallowed by the Mexican mafia. You ever regret it? Reynaldo asked. Ruben was counting cans of refried beans, marking numbers on a clipboard. He didn't look up. Regret what? All of this. The life. The choices. Ruben stopped counting, set the clipboard down, looked at Reynaldo with eyes that had seen too much. Every single day, he said quietly, but regret doesn't change where you are. You can sit in here hating yourself, or you can find a way to survive it. Those are your options. What about getting out? Reynaldo asked. Changing. Ruben smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. It was tired, resigned. You've got 15 years, right? You'll get out eventually. I won't. But here's what I'll tell you. This place follows you. Even when you leave, the things you learn in here, the things you become, they don't wash off. You'll go home, see your family, try be normal. But you'll always be looking over your shoulder, always calculating, always ready for threat. He picked up the clipboard again. That's the real sentence. Not the years. The way it changes who you are. Reynaldo went back to his cell that night, thinking about Ruben's words. Hector was asleep, or pretending to be. Reynaldo climbed onto his bunk and lay there in the dark, listening to familiar sounds of the unit settling into another night. He thought about his sister, about the grandmother who'd raised him after his mother left, about the neighborhood he'd tried to represent, to protect, to honor by claiming Tango. And he wondered if any of it had been worth it. The tattoo on his forearm, the Houston skyline, the star, the word Hostone in careful script, had seemed like pride when he got it, a declaration of identity. But now it felt like a brand, a permanent mark that would follow him long after he left this place. He couldn't go back to who he was before. That version of himself didn't exist anymore. But maybe he could still decide who he became next. It was a small thought, fragile, easy to dismiss in a place like this. But it was something. And in Eastfield Unit, in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, in a cell designed to warehouse human beings until they were no longer a problem, sometimes a small thought was the only thing that kept you human. Reynaldo closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd wake up at 4:47 a.m. He'd walk to the kitchen. He'd do his job. He'd navigate the invisible rules, the unstated hierarchies, the constant calculation of survival. But tonight, for just a moment, he let himself imagine something different. A life where $50 didn't cost a man his safety. Where identity didn't require violence. Where going home meant more than just leaving a cage. It was a dream, maybe a foolish one. But dreams were the last thing they couldn't take from you. What remains? The story of Tango Blast isn't just about Houston or Texas, or even the prison system. It's about what happens when society creates conditions that make belonging more valuable than freedom. These men, Reynaldo, Chewy, Beto, Ruben, thousands of others across the state, didn't wake up one day and decide to join a gang. They made choices, yes, but those choices were shaped by neighborhoods without opportunity, schools without resources, streets without protection, by a justice system that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation, warehousing over reform. And once they entered that system, they found themselves in a world with its own logic, its own economy, its own ruthless mathematics of survival. Tango Blast filled a void. It gave men identity in a place designed to strip it away. It offered protection in an environment where the state couldn't or wouldn't provide it. It created structure where official systems had failed. But it also perpetuated cycles of violence, trauma, and control. It turned young men into soldiers in conflicts they didn't start. It made survival contingent on allegiance, and allegiance contingent on violence. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice still struggles to contain Tango Blast. With no central leadership to target, no formal hierarchy to dismantle, the organization persists. New members join every day. New chapters form in new units. The network expands, adapts, survives. And when these men are released, when their sentences end and they return to Houston, to Dallas, to San Antonio, they carry that identity with them. Some try to leave it behind. Some succeed. Many don't, because the real question isn't whether prison gangs will ever disappear. It's whether we're willing to address the conditions that make them necessary. Reynaldo Garza will be eligible for parole in 11 years. His sister will be 28 by then. His grandmother may not live to see him come home. The neighborhood he left will have changed, transformed by gentrification, displacement, the slow erasure of the communities that raised him. But the tattoo on his arm will remain. And the choices he makes between now and release, whether to embrace what he's become or fight to imagine something different, will determine not just his future, but the future of everyone connected to him. Because in the end, prison isn't just about the people inside. It's about all of us. The communities we neglect, the systems we underfund, the human beings we'd rather forget than confront. Tango Blast is a mirror, and if we're brave enough to look into it, we might not like what we see, but we might finally understand what needs to change.